Hi, this is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and in this video lesson for the SSCP certification exam, I'm going to discuss continuous monitoring. That's how to keep track of the systems on your network and how to monitor for active assaults against your resources. First, I just want to show you a slide showing how monitoring happens in enterprises. So the process of enterprise monitoring is collecting data from all the different hosts on your network in some central place. So as you can see from this diagram, there's a central monitoring station in the middle of the slide. And then all these different types of devices are reporting information to it. Sometimes the monitoring station will actively reach out and request data too. The most common protocol for monitoring is SNMP, which is the Simple Network Monitoring Protocol. It's really primitive, and honestly it has almost no security, but it's really widely supported by just about every different type of monitoring software out there. And lots of different devices such as printers and routers and switches from all sorts of different vendors support this SNMP standard because it is an open standard. So if you happen to see a question about SNMP, be aware that this is for monitoring. So the types of data that typically get collected from systems like these are: how busy are your processors? How full is your disk? How many pages have you printed today? How many different networks do you have attached to you? There can also be monitoring alerts when a particular event happens, like when a disk gets almost filled up, when a processor has stated 100% for over a certain amount of time, when a printer is out of ink or out of paper. And presumably the monitoring station collects all this data and then does something useful with it. Maybe it sends an alert to an IT guy's smartphone to say, hey, get over to the printer on the second floor, it seems to be malfunctioning. Now, monitoring isn't necessarily a function of traditional security, but if you look at that CIA triad, monitoring is definitely important for availability, because monitoring not only tells you when a system is offline, which would allow you to jump on it and get it fixed as soon as possible, thus improving the availability of it, but monitoring can also proactively warn you about devices that are going to fail. For example, all modern hard drives support this SMART protocol, and the SMART protocol allows the hard drive to report on its own health. Often before a hard drive fails, especially these old magnetic hard drives as opposed to the new flash-based ones, the hard drive will detect lots and lots of errors. It will have to read the same space over and over again to get the data correctly. And when it notices these symptoms occurring, it can raise a SMART alert that will propagate up to the operating system, and the operating system in turn can throw a monitoring alert based on the drive SMART alert. So it would go from being the drive's SMART-based alert to an SNMP alert that would go to the monitoring station, and then the monitoring station would interpret the data, decide if it's important or not, and throw it up to the administrators to go in and maybe take a look at the hard drive or just replace it. Now, the hardest part about monitoring is filtering through all the different billions of alerts that you'll see and figuring out the ones that are actually meaningful to you. There's a term I want you to be familiar with, and that's signal-to-noise ratio. Signal is the meaningful alerts that you actually listen to, and noise is all the stuff you don't care about, and monitoring tends to have a terrible signal-to-noise ratio. There's an awful lot of noise that you don't want to see that you have to filter through before you actually find the important and meaningful events. So good monitoring systems are good at filtering the signal from the noise. Now let's talk about two closely related types of security monitoring, which are intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. There are two different really closely related systems: intrusion detection systems, also known as IDS, and intrusion prevention systems, often called IPS. The difference is basically how they respond to an attack. They both detect attacks in the same way. An intrusion detection system simply logs the events, maybe notifies an administrator, and waits for a human being to do something. An intrusion prevention system can actually initiate an active response without the human being having to do anything. Now, it sounds pretty scary that you might have a system that would automatically take action on your network without human intervention, but there are some clear-cut cases where an intrusion prevention system can detect an attack with certainty and respond to it in a reliable way. For example, with the rise of online multiplayer games, let's say it's Call of Duty, we also see a rise on denial of service attacks against individuals on the internet. So you're playing Call of Duty with somebody and you're just kicking his butt and you're just killing him over and over again. He might go punch your IP address into a system that will launch a denial of service attack against you. You can purchase the rights to these systems for a few Bitcoins. It can be really cheap, just a few pennies, and it'll take you offline for 15 minutes or so. That's enough to kick you out of the game and kind of ruin your evening of fun. It's also enough to let him maybe win, and it might even count as a loss against you. So these types of user-to-user denial of service attacks have become really common, and ISPs are handling this by setting up intrusion prevention systems that look for the signs of an active denial of service attack against one of their users, and then they just drop all the traffic. So the intrusion detection part of it detects the attack, and then the intrusion prevention system just sends a note to the router that says, all the incoming packets to this IP address that look like this, just drop them so the guy can keep using his network connection. Intrusion prevention systems can also be wired into a honeypot, which I'll discuss a little bit later. In brief, a honeypot is a fake system that just listens for incoming connections, and because it's not a real system doing anything of value, anybody who connects to it must be malicious, right? Therefore, if the intrusion prevention system communicates with the honeypot, it can wait for people to try to connect to the honeypot, and when it sees that, it can just kick them out. It can just send a note to the router and say, any future requests from this IP address, just filter it, because this guy's already tried to connect to a fake system, so he's definitely up to no good. Up first, the intrusion detection systems, sometimes called IDS, or they'll call it a network intrusion detection system, NIDS. Intrusion detection systems inspect the network traffic and they look for patterns that might indicate an ongoing attack or some sort of threat. And of course, if they see something, hopefully they raise an alert and let an administrator know what's going on, either so the administrator can start watching it more closely, or maybe so the administrator can actually take action to stop the attack in progress. IDS systems are incredibly complex. They have to have these really complex algorithms and often lots of signatures. So there's always a lot of software that needs to be involved. So it is common for IDS to be software that's installed on a traditional PC architecture, maybe running in Unix or Linux or running on a Windows-based platform. You can also get IDS systems that are integrated into a hardware device. So they act more like a traditional piece of network equipment, like a router or a switch, where you just plug it in and plug in an Ethernet adapter and let it do its job. The only difference between an intrusion detection system and an intrusion prevention system is the prevention system can automatically respond to alerts. So the IDS, its job is really to let an administrator know that something needs to be handled. The IPS will often automatically launch a response to specific conditions. So ISPs use IPSs all the time and with a great deal of success, because what happens is two people will be playing Call of Duty and they're both at home with their home internet connections, and one guy just kills the other guy just over and over again, and the guy getting killed gets upset. So it's common practice in these types of scenarios to launch a denial of service attack on your opponent. It's not good form, it's rude, it's poor sportsmanship, but it happens all the time. So he could go to one of these many services and you'll pay a few Bitcoins to this company, and usually it's a teenager who's hacked a bunch of bot computers. But anyway, your opponent will launch a denial of service attack on your personal home IP address, and it'll just be flooding it with traffic, and it will take your connection offline. Well, this could be a real bummer to you, right? And theoretically, this could just go on indefinitely, and you would never be able to use the internet until your IP address changed, or you got a new ISP, something like that. So what ISPs have done is they've implemented real-time intrusion prevention systems that watch for these incoming attacks, whether denial of service or other types of attacks. And when they see it, well, they just drop the traffic. So they drop it at the edge of their network rather than allowing it to get all the way to your home PC so it can be flooded. And that can help keep you online. And if an ISP has tens of thousands of customers, you can bet that there's at least a dozen different denial of service attacks going on at any given time, because these things are really, really common, especially since these real-time games have started to become popular. And you can push a couple of buttons and take any opponent out of the game indefinitely. Well, ISPs have started to respond, so these intrusion prevention systems are making a real difference. So let's talk about the two systems that IDS and IPS systems use to recognize an attack: signature-based and behavior-based or heuristic. Signature-based intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems work just like your signature-based anti-malware system. They look for a particular set of bits or bytes in the traffic that's crossing your network, and if they see something that is typically associated with malware or hacking attacks, well, they throw an alarm. Or in the case of an intrusion prevention system, perhaps they actually respond. The challenge with signature-based attacks is, of course, somebody has to go through network traffic and look at these attacks and then put together a signature that will match them. And because attacks are changing all the time, that means there needs to be a guy going through traffic all the time and making new signatures. That means you generally need to pay for signature updates, and you need to keep your signature database up to date. No big deal. You can set up automatic updates and you pay a little bit of a fee and you keep things up to date, and it's generally worth it. Signatures can fall into one or two categories. Content-based signature looks for a particular string of characters or maybe a bit set in the header, and this content would only appear in some sort of malicious packet, something that was an attack made by a known hacking tool. Context-based signatures are a little more sophisticated. They look at other packets and groups of packets and patterns. So, for example, you could use context-based signatures to detect a port scan. While noticing that a single incoming connection request to port 80 wouldn't indicate an attack, it could just be somebody typed in the wrong IP address for a web server. If you see incoming requests for port 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 through the entire range, well, that's a port scan, but it requires the context of the other incoming requests. Therefore, it's a context-based signature. Heuristic systems, also known as behavior-based or anomaly-based systems, don't look for signatures specifically. Instead, they create a baseline of your normal network traffic. You just tell it to watch what's going on a day when there's not an attack. And then they compare any future traffic against those established patterns. They look for unusual network behavior regardless of what it might be. So if they see a sudden spike in volume, well, that would be considered unusual network behavior. If they suddenly see a different type of network packet or a protocol that hasn't been used before, this would be considered an anomaly, and they could, in theory, raise an alert. You usually wouldn't want an intrusion prevention system to just shut down something that seemed unusual, because after all, it's probably legitimate traffic, but it doesn't hurt to raise an alarm and have an administrator take a look at it. Most new IDS or IPS systems will combine both signature-based and behavior-based systems to kind of give you the best of both worlds. But I'll tell you what, you'll get the most use out of the signature-based systems. The behavior-based systems, I find, they're kind of flaky. I mean, that's just real-world advice. Let's talk about the weaknesses of an intrusion detection system. The first is just a ton of false positives, as well as false negatives. The difference is a false positive is an alarm that isn't really something you care about. So it says, oh no, something's going on, and you go to take a look at it, and it's something that's totally normal and you didn't need to know about. And that gets incredibly frustrating, especially when it wakes you up at 3 a.m. because you're the guy who's on call. And IDSs do this all the time, and I've learned to kind of treat them with a grain of salt. There are specific signature-based systems that can detect well-known attacks like ping floods and SYN attacks, and those can be really useful and 100%. But these kind of behavior-based things, there's a lot of false positives, and that's frustrating. A false negative is even worse, usually. That means that the system doesn't detect an actual ongoing attack, and that happens a lot because attacks are constantly changing, and because the attackers crafting these attacks know that these IDS systems go out there and they craft them in specific ways to not look like an attack. They're clever. IDSs also can't inspect encrypted data. So something just needs to use HTTPS, and then you'll never see what's going on. And IDS also requires a lot of manual intervention. It requires a lot of human interpretation to determine the good from the bad. Like I said, there are clear-cut cases where it's obviously an attack, But there are also a lot of cases where you have to look at the alarm and go in there and determine whether something needs to be done. They also require a lot of fine-tuning. You can teach it to ignore specific types of false positives that are appearing all the time, and maybe you even find a few attacks that it overlooked, and you can tweak those so that they actually show up as a true positive. IDSs also generate a lot of alarms, so there's a lot of signals there, and they can take a lot of processing time, especially on a busy network, so they can be kind of expensive. So now let's go into more detail about honeypots. A honeypot is a fake server. It sits there and maybe it has a web server running, maybe it has a file server running, but it's not anything that anybody in your network actually needs. It might impersonate a real server, but nobody is configured to connect to it. It's a trap. It's a sting operation. It's waiting for an attacker to find it and maybe do a port scan on it, maybe try to hack into it, maybe connect with a password. It might even have easy to hack passwords so that you can see exactly what the attacker does once they compromise the system. Usually they're basically a virtual machine with legit software running on it. So it'll have a legit copy of Windows or Linux or whatever you might use, except that it's contained within a virtual machine. Honeypots are a lot of fun because they'll just log everything that happens. And because there's no legit reason to connect to a honeypot, you know, every connection to it is malicious. And you can watch what the latest types of attacks are. You can see exactly what happens after the compromise. So after somebody gets your accounts, do they just upload files to it so that they can share them with the internet without paying for the bandwidth or without maybe risking legal action because they're putting up some sort of illegal files on your server? They might try to install a bot on it so they can control it in the future and use it in denial of service attacks or sell the processing capability for a few bitcoins. Anyway, honeypots are a lot of fun, so if you get the chance, I would definitely look into setting one up. Even on your own home network connected to your home ISP, just set up a honeypot and plug it directly into your router because you'll get attacked a lot. It's fun to watch. A honeynet is just a term I want you to be familiar with. Basically, it's a whole network that is a honeypot. So you can watch network-wide scans going on, moving from one IP address to another. If you can see if somebody compromises one computer and then uses it to attack other computers, it's generally also virtualized, just like a single virtual machine. The entire network will be virtual, just running within a walled garden on a single PC somewhere. They often have a single sign-on system, an Active Directory server, user accounts set up with maybe weak passwords and strong passwords, so it can look like an entire corporation, a whole business is going on, and the whole thing is fake. If you're an attacker, it'd be like you stumbled into the matrix, but you probably wouldn't be able to figure it out. Just like a honeypot, it's really cool to see what attackers do when they start to probe your network. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.